Hi guys, it's Luke
And Gabriel here.
and we're back for another episode of Clinical Trial Talk.
That's right. So how come we weren't around last week?
Well, last week we were under the pump because we actually work in clinical trials and sometimes there's not enough time to get away from the desk. We weren't having a holiday, nothing enjoyable or fun about that. Okay, so, but sometimes everyone needs a break, but in terms of this, we just didn't have time to do it, and we're going to try and make sure we don't have to give you those sorts of reasons in the future. We'll keep them more consistent. Today's been pretty amazing. We're in Australia. If you didn't notice our accents, but today was the Melbourne Cup Day.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, pretty exciting.
Yeah, so you can see we're just bouncing off the walls here in terms of excitement. Look, some people like it, some people don't like it. We're based in Sydney, so we don't get the public holiday like the Melbourneites. So we're here crushing away at what we need to do to get studies done.
That's right.
So what were we hoping to talk about today?
Well, when we talk about clinical trials, there's not just one type of clinical trial. There's actually quite a few phases, as they call them. And we'd like to go through today what are the different phases of clinical trials? Where does a drug start, and where does its journey go to before it comes onto the market and available for purchase?
Yeah. So I mean, we're talking about products. It might be a medical device. It might be a new biological therapy. It might be a new chemical entity.
Or like a procedure or something.
A procedure, could be anything. Whatever the investigational product as such. We're obviously peak groups, and whether it's doctors or companies or institutions, whatever it might be, are trying to test these products for primarily safety, and then they want to see whether or not the product works.
Yep.
And so you can't just go straight into selling the product without having done these different staged approach to the research, that is the clinical trials.
And in fact, you can't just go straight into testing on humans, can you?
You can't just go straight into humans, and I suppose, look, there's been a lot of talk today specifically about Melbourne Cup and people boycotting because of, animals being mistreated and whatnot. I can't really speak on behalf of sports because I'm not too familiar with it. With clinical research, before a product will go into the clinic, which is when it's tested on humans, there needs to be, depending on what it is, some degree of testing in animals, and that is as rigorous in terms of its ethics and the procedures and what should happen as it is when it goes into the clinic, so that the information that's collected is collected in a way that is giving a proper insight into how that product will work. And some products will be tested in different kind of animals. I'm not a toxicologist, but there are people that are toxicologists that have a very deep understanding in terms of, what sort of animals you would need to test certain products in, and the numbers. There's a whole process for that. But we get involved in clinical trials, which is when it finally gets accepted by an ethics committee and the various scientific review committees, to say, okay, based on that previous preclinical or animal testing.
Yeah.
And
that's not to say that they always get tested on animals. Sometimes it could be on, just like tissue or some kind of
exactly.
thing.
I was speaking with a guy last week actually who's doing something amazing, where he's basically creating an ability to review what will be tested in humans even. So he doesn't have to use a human. I mean, there's artificial intelligence, there's a whole lot of like modeling and different kinds of technology that look at cells and things like that from different organisms.
Exactly.
So obviously there's a drive to not have to, risk human safety or animal safety for that matter. Yeah. And, when I see things like, no animal testing and things like that, I think that's great.
Yeah,
I mean, but then the thing is, I always think back to clinical trials, and I think, well, this is probably why clinical trials themselves can be polarizing in the community, and people either hate them or love them or don't trust them or whatever it might be. But the point is that I sometimes think, well, people are also, to get a medicine on the market, required for regulatory authorization. to go through some kind of research in humans.
Mm-hmm. And it's different with, for example, cosmetic testing on animals. There's no safety component in that case. So the justification there is quite a lot weaker, if there's any at all. But with clinical trials and actually testing medicines and things that can actually affect and harm humans, then there may be more of a need to do that sort of testing until we obviously develop other methods.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that cosmetic testing, for example, and there's a bit of a boundary, there's a sort of, I think cosmetics and cosmeceuticals and things that have some kind of effect or impact on a human or even, that they're starting, I think that most regulatory authorities are starting to become a bit more stringent also on things such as foods and also cosmetics and natural things like that sometimes fall outside of what the regulatory rigor of a medicine is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's put under.
Okay.
Anyway, we digress.
So that's what we generally.
So.
No, definitely, it's very important. But it's definitely important to know that phase one, which is the first time that the drug, the orthotherapy is being tested in humans, is not the first time the drug is going to be tested in general. There's a phase 0, which is what we were talking about, that preclinical component.
Well, no, actually, there's phase 0. People are starting to call phase 0 like
is...
PK studies, pharmacokinetics, and stuff
right.
like that.
Yes,
so that's right. The preclinical.
Yeah.
So it is really phase 1. I think it's more of a new school. Some people are calling it phase 0. So the very first time in human, we call it FIH, first in human.
I thought phase 0 was when you tested not in.
I think if you ask different people, they'll have different definitions of it. But if you hit up the old trustworthy Wikipedia, how trustworthy is it? Let's have a quick squiz. You'll see that phase 0 they're talking about is to do with pharmacokinetics and bioavailability, specifically regarding the half-life of a product. So that's how long it takes to get rid of half of that product, of the active product, from your body. So I think we were talking before, often pharmacokinetics or pharmacodynamics are two different things, and those are something that's really important that's being looked at that early stage. Not just, safety's obviously the very first thing, but obviously companies want to measure how fast, pharmacokinetics is how fast it takes to go through your body. And
there's a pharmacodynamics, which is how the compound of the chemical is interacting with your own body's chemistry.
Yeah.
So that needs to be understood before anything else can go ahead.
There's some products where the mechanism of action isn't completely understood, and it may not be for quite some time. And so obviously, if you can figure out what's going on, that's pretty important.
Yes, that's right.
And
to also set, if you can understand what's happening, you can potentially predict any problems that might be occurring later down the line, maybe due to buildup of a product inside a person's body, or any kind of reactions with other sort of medicines.
Yeah, so phase 1, if you're looking into, if you look at Wikipedia, they're saying it's only healthy volunteers that will be in that study. There are other studies which is not just healthy volunteers, so I'll call Wiki out on that one. And
so, for example, cancer, you wouldn't be able to.
Well, that's right. In some cases, there's cancer therapies that look specifically at end-stage cancer or patients that have used up any other possibility of other treatment, and it's not expected that they're going to live, and so the options are really small. And so there may be some new therapy that can prolong life, and so you'd be interested to probably see some data that's out there in terms of how some people have responded to some therapies. And and when I say therapies, I mean investigational products, because they're not technically therapies per se yet at that point. They're only being tested for whether or not they can be therapeutic. Okay.
We might need another episode.
We might need another episode on that. But I've got a bit of a thing about companies call themselves pharmaceutical companies, or they call themselves therapeutics, or what's another word? Medicines, so-and-so medicines, and some of the companies that are there only have a couple of products that are still in testing phase. So they're technically speaking, they might be trying to establish a therapeutic, but at the moment it's not. But they may not have a therapeutic yet.
Fair enough. Yes.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay.
So where were we up to? So we're up to phase 1, right?
So phase
First
1,
in human.
yeah, and that's really looking at, is the drug safe?
And it could be that they're also testing a product that is also already on the market for some other thing, and they want to test it in whether or not it will work for some other indication. Okay, and sometimes they may even, well, that's right. If it's a completely new thing that hasn't been tested before, generally speaking, it'd be phase 1.
Yep.
And the other one probably for that one would be to do with, no, I'll save that for later.
Okay.
Let's keep moving forward. What's after 1? I'm assuming it's 2.
I think it's 2, yeah. And in phase 2, it's kind of the first time that we're really looking into whether a drug is actually efficacious. Does the drug actually work? Yeah. Right? So phase 1, you might have a smaller number of subjects within the clinical trial. Here in Wikipedia it says 20 to 100, although I think 100 is quite high for a phase 1 study.
Let's not get too worried about what Wikipedia is saying. They're saying that success rate, if you look at the table, I mean, that's if it's still current when you watch this, but approximately 70% of there's a 70% success rate. Now, maybe it's right. I don't know where they're getting the data from, but I would have thought that there would be a lot less. Well, safety, maybe it is all right.
But efficacy, yeah, I definitely agree. Anyway.
But that's the thing. The better the research is before it even gets to humans in terms of the lab and what's done in the lab before, and what's done before it even enters humans. I mean, a lot of research isn't necessarily to good lab practice. A lot of the universities don't necessarily conduct research to GLP. Okay, so when it comes to actually saying that their data is trustworthy, I think that's a big topic. Some universities swear by the fact that they can be audited and they do it to GLP. Other universities don't have the same level of scrutiny, and their quality is measured on the number of papers that are produced. That's my little bit of beef. But I mean, look, it's not a beef, it's a fact. And I think people need to talk more about that.
Okay, no, yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what are we talking about? So you're talking about phase 2. So I mean, look, there's some companies that will try to do what you call a phase 1/2, where they try to get 2 studies done in the one hit, which can be good and bad. It can work, it can not work as well. And you can try to do too many things, and then you end up, some companies really want to show efficacy even at the phase 1, like give me safety and show me some efficacy. And there might not be the numbers of patients to really show it. So it's not until you get to the phase 3 that you get the big numbers, that when you really see whether or not. But the whole point of having a smaller number at phase 2 before you get to the phase 3 is you don't expose a huge population to, and you don't spend too much money to figure out whether it could be efficacious, right? So you've got to get some good data in phase 2, and then you're like, right, let's go and do it in a whole lot of people.
Promising, so we'll expand the trial. Okay. So phase 3 is kind of testing a specific therapy or medicine on a much broader scale. So this could be, hundreds, thousands of people in different countries, different cities, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
logistical, great, loving it. People, I mean, it can be a real headache to organise a lot of different countries and a lot of different patients, but
definitely. But that's what you have to do.
That's it. And then I think is probably the last phase would be phase 4, right?
Right.
So that'd be, in most cases, people are talking about 4 in regard to post-marketing studies. So once the product's approved, that's if it actually passed phase 3 and all the other phases. You don't get to phase 3 unless you've done phase 2. Some people try to call it 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, whatever you want to call it. Once you get to being on the market, it's approved by what you call a regulatory authority, which is the FDA in the States, Food and Drug Administration. You've got TGA here, Therapeutic Goods Administration. There's a whole list of them around the world, right? Often there will be a requirement to do research on the product and its use and how it's used, how it's being received once it's actually being prescribed, if something that's prescribed, but something that's keeping an eye on how it's actually working in real life.
Exactly. These can be pretty tricky kind of studies, because you no longer have that sort of really controlled clinical context in which you're gathering data. You might have a bunch of different sources, like people posting about it on the internet, or maybe it's just doctors that are prescribing the information, reporting back to you, all that sort of stuff. So you can kind of start to see that I think post-marketing can be quite a difficult type of study to do.
I find it easier.
You reckon?
Yeah, it's easier, but it depends on what it is.
Maybe not on the data analysis side.
Well, it can be a headache. It can be a headache because it's not necessarily collected always with the same level of consistency and continuity. Agree completely. Right.
But maybe easier in terms of the fact that because the drug is already approved for market use, then you might have less. It may be less of a barrier to entry in terms of actually starting the study because that product's there and the data's all there. You just kind of need to gather it all up.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not that straightforward to get access to data and those sorts of things. The way that companies need to go about trying to get access isn't always as easy as people tend to think in terms of. And when I say collect data, I don't mean collect personal information on people. I mean collecting anonymized information, which means that it's done in a private manner.
Yep.
And that's important. So, in a nutshell, do we think we covered it? Probably the only other thing would be, I mean, there's other, in terms of safety reviewing, it's not just kept to the phase 1. Safety is looked at right the way through, even beyond marketing, post-marketing.
Yep.
There's products that are on the market that require pharmacovigilance, they call it, monitoring.
Continual monitoring.
While they're on the market.
Yeah, exactly. So in phase 1 and 2, you might be really looking at acute sort of adverse effects, but maybe in phase 3 and 4, you might have the numbers to pick up more subtle trends or changes that may not have been able to be detected on a small population. So yeah, definitely safety always, the data for safety is always gathered throughout all clinical trials.
Yeah. Also, in terms of clinical trial design, this is probably a bit off topic, but there's more and more of a movement towards people or real life data or community data to assist with study design and everything with clinical trials. And I mean, that's not just from the sponsor companies or the doctors themselves. It's actually across the board. Even regulatory authorities are encouraging that. And in some cases will require you to have some sort of knowledge about the illness beyond and the study design before you even start the study and when you're designing the study.
Right.
And so in that process, they've found in some of the regulatory authorities, at least in terms of their discussions with companies that are doing research on some therapeutic areas, that there's actually like different levels or kinds of illnesses that may not have been noticed before because there wasn't that understanding of, that kind of patient's getting this thing all the time. That patient gets it on an off basis. So there might be 2 different kinds of patients and populations that weren't understood previously, but it's probably way off topic. But that whole component, I mean, whether you call it phase 0 or preclinical, it's probably more like a community engagement component before a research project starts. And so, I mean,
the community doesn't necessarily have to be engaged. That could happen through all stages of the clinical trial, right?
Well, that's right. And there's groups that are trying to develop ways to do that because that's sort of like now that people can access people easier online and all those sorts of things. There's new ways to think about it. I think there's a thing at the moment that one of the groups is working on to have a standardized way of asking questions before a study starts, during it, and after it's finished.
Okay.
But I mean, I think we've covered probably.
Yeah, a lot of ground we covered, I think. So.
I think that's okay. Let us know if there's another kind that we didn't think of. There's probably another one there that's to do with virtual clinical trials and things like that. More often than not, phase 1 studies will be conducted in the clinic.
Okay. Yeah. Either that, or if you guys have been in a clinical trial and you're not really sure what phase it is, describe it to us. We might be able to help you out and place it within context.
Yeah, and if there's some method to the madness of 1A, 1B, and 2A, 2B, and 3A, 3B, you got to understand that whether or not it's called this or that, it's achieving a certain point in the standard process.
That's the main thing.
And what you'll find is some companies, they'll put on their websites product pipeline. And so if you're looking at a company that you're interested in who's actually running research on something that you're specifically keen on, or a product or some sort of thing that they're working on, you'll see product pipeline, okay? And so basically that'll tell you whether or not they're still in the preclinical stage. It usually it'll be like they've kind of got
Like a flowchart sort of thing, right?
preclinical, phase 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they'll like tell you this particular product here is up to there, this product's up to phase 1, and you'll see where they're up to. So hopefully from what we've talked about today, you'll have a bit more of an idea of what that means. So if they're kind of still coming out of preclinical, you might want to suss out, when are you going to finally test this in the phase 1. But so going back to what I was saying, some companies kind of want to look good as well for investors, I think, and they'll try and say, we're going straight into a phase 1, 2, okay. So some companies want to basically run a study, and then they want to sell their product to a big company to go and spend the big money, because phase 3 with a lot of people around the world costs a lot more money. And often they might have a bunch of other projects they want to focus on or other technologies, so they want to sell it after phase 1, because it means that the bigger companies can say, right, I like, it's got some good data, but if that company doesn't have the possibility to take it further, in some cases it's a bigger company, or they need investment to be able to spend the money to do that, and not all products will get there.
That's right.
So when they say they're doing phase 1, 2, companies look like they're further ahead than they may well be, even though they're probably doing pretty much phase 1 and 2 kind of in the line.
Okay, should probably wrap up. It was a pretty long video. Thanks for staying with us. If you watched it to the end, let us know what you liked, what you thought we could do better in terms of explaining.
We need all the help we can get. All right, thanks a lot, guys, for your time.
Guys.